Hello and welcome to revision tips for CIPS Level 6, Professional Diploma in Procurement and Supply. This is Module 10, which is Global Logistics Strategy, and it's Learning Outcome 2, Understanding Global Governance in the Supply Chain. We're going to look at the strategic influence of globalised supply chain governance and the impacts of international legislation on globalised supply chains. So we're going to learn about those global governances. It's important to look at global governance of your supply chains, their geographical spread, and supply chain network complexity arising from that global nature. And you'll also need to appreciate the need for a role of coordination between the units and the elements, as well as technology that enable coordination within your global supply chains. Now, global logistics is the process and management of the flow of goods through a supply chain involving a supplier in different logistical territories onto the ultimate consumer. It involves the physical execution of international commercial transactions, such as sales, investments, and transports, often have an exchange component that requires physical goods and raw materials to be imported, exported, and delivered to a seaport, airport, or warehouse somewhere in the world. These globalized commercial and trade environments are made possible by advantages in local global logistic networks, as well as the systems, processes, and capabilities. Global logistics is characterized by a vast geographical distance covered by a typical order-to-delivery operation process. It's also characterized by complexity, given the large number of intermediaries involved, like depots, terminals, warehouses, transport modes, and markets. And cargo documents in global logistics is complex, but it has, I suppose it has to accommodate the laws and regulations of the governing bodies and national authorities. So you're addressing different and diverse work patterns, time zones, cultures, languages, customs, traditions, and value systems needed to source, store, transport, and deliver cargoes around the world. So there are 7 key questions that multinational corporations should ask as part of global operations. What global alliances and partnerships should be established in order to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of our globalized network? Where in the world should we procure our raw materials, our semi-finished materials, our services, components, and so on? Where in the world should we store or distribute our services and products? Where in the world should we locate our plants and our support facilities to produce products and services to meet customer demand? And where in the world should we market and sell our products or services? What global communication alternatives should we consider and use? And what global transport modes should we consider and use? So what are the considerations? The spread of international internet technology, mobile phones, and e-commerce. It's all bridged the gap, hasn't it? The geographical gap between nations, and facilitated the geographical spread of global logistic activities. And global logistics covers vast geographical areas, involves addressing different and diverse work patterns, time zones, cultures, languages, customs, traditions, and even those different value systems. The complexity of global operations often require an expertise in transport and trade facilitation across the international borders. It will include specialist knowledge of cargo documents, customs clearances, tariffs, and trade laws. And networks are complex due to the large number of intermediaries involved: depots, terminals, warehouses, transport modes, and markets. Global supply chain network designs, governance and strategy is directly based on the nature of services and products being procured, manufactured and distributed. So when designing a global supply chain, you need to consider strategic things such as the number of locations of your facilities and the amount of capacity in each, the assignment of each market region to one or more of your locations, supplier selection for your sub-assemblies, components or materials. Global logistics supply chains must be robust and resilient to counter the risk of disruption given their long distances, expanded networks, geographical spread, and associated culture, languages, and geographies. Effective coordination and collaboration across the entire network are vital to ensure product availability, on-time delivery, and customer services. So I mentioned third-party logistics and fourth-party logistic providers on Learning Outcome 1. They're basically outsourced organisations that offer long-term services to carry out buying, your distribution and fulfilment services. So work to detailed contracts to manage aspects of your firm's logistics operations. It could be things like transport, warehousing, IT, customs brokerage, freight forwarding. And it's taken care of behind the scenes and tasks so that client firms can focus on business development, sales and marketing. We aim to improve synchronization and supply chain efficiency and cooperation. And it can deliver cost savings, lower capital and asset commitment, and look at the customer time requirements, demand profiles and supply profiles to calculate the current process task and cycle time. You can also reduce your inventory levels, mapping and understanding the target process, and evaluate process capacity, eliminating any waste of time or wasted activity in the process. Use advanced IT and new technologies to coordinate the global supply chain and use standardized communication protocols. This will help you to foster a timely and accurate sharing and flow of product, transport and information flows. Now, the fourth-party logistics can also be referred to as lead logistic providers and supply chain integrators. They offer services that extend the third-party logistics services. The concept promoted by several researchers, technology vendors and analysts, where the third-party logistic providers offer an even higher level of valuable services, and they extend beyond the physical transport, freight forwarding and warehousing. They can act as a single point of contact and interface between the firm and other logistics services. And every aspect of your firm's supply chain is managed by the 4PL. They differ from 3PL providers in a way that they are often separate entities established as a joint venture with long-term contracts between the client and one or more of its supply chain partners. Global firms require effective global supply chain organisation networks to manage the challenges and complexity of global logistic activities in their supply chains. They also need to ensure that the information technology is fit for purpose. So firms are embracing this kind of customer-centric view of a product or a service. And because of this, the role of information and customer service teams within those firms has become more important. But you should note that the different ways in which internal information management and customer service capabilities have been structured fall into kind of two well-recognized implementation models. You've got the centralized and distributed use of decentralized embedded teams, physically present for coordination within major supply chain operations around the world. Or virtual centralization, where computer-mediated or virtual teams are meant to perform the same functions but are not available on a physical face-to-face basis. So in this regard, global firms need to consider answering strategic questions like, how do they need, the needs of virtually centralized teams differ from the needs of these embedded face-to-face teams? What type of tasks are best fulfilled by the virtual teams? And what tasks are required face-to-face contact? So an embedded team is an approach typically seen individual team members spread throughout the supply chain, embedding themselves within the teams of individual supply chain participants to assist with task development, information dissemination, and improvement process. This model generally retains a centralized manager or a management system, and often members of such embedded teams are generalists rather than specialists. The virtual centralization approach, the team is located separately away from the supply chain participants. They perform the role of remote control and timely dissemination of information with reliance on IT. So embedded teams, they usually blame central teams when something goes wrong. So I guess the benefits of embedded teams are timely information, development of interpersonal relations, team members are able to empathize, and the value of embedded teams is recognized. But virtual centralization provides a sense of professional identity, easier to maintain technology standards and processes, and you've got no risk of duplication. So we're now going to look at decentralized centralization, which is central reporting and working, but not centrally co-located. So global logistics and supply chain management have moved from being a simple phenomenon to being a coordinated management of more complex entities and firms that could span multiple geographical locations, multiple repetitive transactions, and different organization affiliations. And IT is clearly the enabler for this global activity. So a co-located supply chain program would look at multiple activities running in one location. A distributed supply chain is a single endeavor conducted from multiple geographical locations. So in global logistics supply chain management, much of the effort in incorporating technology has involved fostering constant communication among supply chain network participants, while facilitating information and knowledge. So it shows that information and knowledge generated by supply chain activities can be categorized as three types. You've got knowledge and information within supply chain activities. That's your kind of post hoc analysis and audit of key insights and learnings generated from carrying out global supply chain activities. And that's all about organization, learning and development. The second is the knowledge and information about supply chain activities, transport, production, etc. So this is looking at shipment schedules, milestones, transport-related information, production shipments, the types of cargoes, cost and benefit analysis, deadlines, expected time of arrival, and the nature of cargo, which might be things like, I don't know, hazardous materials or something like that. And then knowledge and information within the supply chain calls for a close look at insights generated within each individual supply chain, shipment cargoes like schedules and milestones. And that's relevant individuals within the individual firm that need to know when, what, how, where, and why something is being done and by whom. The aim of knowledge and information from within the supply chain is to promote efficient and effective coordination of activities. So from a macro perspective, a global supply chain organization must have an inventory of all shipments and associated tasks underway at any given time. This aids the planning and controlling of resources to maximize utilities, Such knowledge and information includes employee assignments to shipments, cost and benefit analysis, deadlines, expected times of arrival, shipment notes, customer commitments, and expectations. And this information and knowledge is commonly generated at regular intervals. That could be weekly, monthly, or whatever it might be. Now, globalization has changed the world's economy, especially in areas of international trade. Global governance of the supply chain is a governing system of structures, roles, and institutions that control, guide, and lead supply chains through policies and regulations. The goal of creating greater efficiency. And these governance systems are put in place by various actors, such as the individual organizations, international organizations, industrial sectors, and within that, the global supply chain. And it's a process of, transforming raw materials into an end product, which often occurs at several different countries, moving services and products from producer to consumer. So as a result of increased globalization and international independence, the process for global supply chain management and its governance is expanding, with its focus on increasing the efficiency of the whole system and the interaction between firms and the systems. Now, the term fragmentation has been used to describe the physical separation of different parts of the production process in contemporary globalization and the global logistics activities that enable such fragmentation. The fragmentation enables production in different countries to be formed into international cross-border production networks that can be within or between networks or firms. But the integration of world trade through globalization and concurrent disintegration of production in the global economy is seen as a paradox. On the one hand, world trade is increasing, interrelating as goods and services are sourced and transported to and from all corners of the world. At the same time, on the other hand, vertical disintegration and the disintegration of production is taking place. So the integration of world markets through trade has triggered a disintegration of multinations. And firms prefer to source nationally and internationally. This has resulted from a growing proportion of international trade in components and the other immediate goods. Now, separability of the flow of information and the flow of ownership is a major aspect of the international and cross-border flow of materials, goods, and cargoes. The transfer of the title and ownership doesn't necessarily occur at the point of delivery. It occurs only when parties wish it to occur. This usually involves as a statement of commercial contracting as part of the invoice. It impacts the transacting party's rights in the event of total or partial loss of goods and damage or destruction of the goods. The key points are it transfers the title, and if the transfer of title has occurred, the buyer may be able or unable to reject the goods, even if they have valid complaints of things like low quality, storage, inaccurate descriptions. But if the buyer acquires the title or ownership and doesn't pay, the seller may sue the buyer for non-payment. So transacting parties specify when the transfer of title of ownership occurs, when the goods are physically located elsewhere and not in the physical possession of the owner. So if separation of ownership is not possible, multinational firms and related foreign direct investments in a foreign country is likely to play a dominant role in the structure of global supply networks and allied trade. So where it is possible to separate the ownership of goods from the flow of goods, arm's length transactional relationships are possible, and foreign direct investment is less important because goods can simply be sourced from independent suppliers in a foreign country. Sturgeon and Lee identified 3 types of supply relationships based on the degree of standardization of products and process. Your commodity supplier provides standard products through arm's length relationships. A captive supplier makes non-standard products using machinery dedicated to the buyer's needs. And a turnkey supplier produces customized products for buyers and uses flexible machinery to pull capacity for different customers. Global supply chain cooperation and governance spectrum is, at one end, market-based arm's length relationship among the firms, and the opposite end, vertical integrated firms or hierarchies. In terms of the immediate mode, the global supply chain network relationship is categorized into 5 broad types of coordination and governance. A hierarchy characterized by vertical integration based on managerial control flowing from managers to subordinates or from headquarters to subsidiaries and affiliates. Markets, often transitionary or transactional, as is typical of spot markets. They may persist over time through repeat transactions. The costs of switching to new partners are low for both parties. Modular value chains. Customers are modular value chains that make products to a customer specification. If you're providing a turnkey service, suppliers take full responsibility for the process technology of use, using generic machinery that limits specific investments and make capital outlays for components and materials on behalf of its customers. Relational value chains have complex interactions between buyers and sellers. That close dependency relationships may be managed through family ties, close friendships, reputation, ethics, trust, spatial proximity, co-location, or length of relationship built up over a period of time. And captive value chains have small suppliers that are transactionally dependent on much larger buyers. And suppliers face significant switching costs and are therefore captive. Such networks are often characterized by a high degree of monitoring and control by the lead firms. Now, when a contract is established between 2 parties in the same country, it's governed by that country's national legal system. However, when a contract is between 2 parties in different countries, there is no specific law governing such contract, except when it's called the Lex Mercatoria, a trade law that is derived from a multitude of international agreements and international trade customs, all of which complement domestic laws. The Lex Mercatoria comprises a multitude of different sources of law. You've got the United Nations treaties or general trade agreements on trades and tariffs, which has evolved into the WTO with its own rules and relations and court systems. You've got multilateral agreements on specific industry issues like the Warsaw Convention on International Air Transport. Regional agreements, Economic Commission of West African States of the European Union, or bilateral agreements, the special status granted by Hong Kong by China, the International Chamber of Commerce rules on international trade or Incoterms, and arbitration decisions established by the International Chamber of Commerce Arbitration Court or private arbitrators, and many more. These aspects are relevant to international logistics and global supply chain management. The contract of sale between the exporter and the importer is covered for most countries by the United Nations Convention of Contracts. And the contract between exporters and foreign agents and contracts between exporters and distributors are also covered by the International Sale of Goods, or the Vienna Convention, and the resolution of arising commercial disputes through an arbitration system. Now, in national legal systems, the concept of a precedent is a starting point of judges thinking and reasoning in considering cases. Judges may pay attention to and respect any past judicial decisions, but sometimes judges may apply the reasoning of judges in previous cases and those past decisions when deciding cases that raise similar facts. So the moral value of the doctrine of precedents is that it serves the ideal of a rule in law in which national institutions such as courts should ensure that the law is applied in a consistent, coherent and predictable manner. So a precedent is an earlier event or action that can be considered in subsequent similar circumstances. Now, which legal system is generally applied by all parties? Multi-countries pass through during the course of trade. But in international contracts, it's a contract that is linked to the national laws and legal systems of at least two countries. Therefore, different interpretations of specific clauses and contracts are quite possible, given potential differences in the laws, regions, customs, cultures, languages, values, history, and legal traditions. This is called the conflict of laws in private international law. Now, in order to manage risks arising from problems of interpretation of laws and potential conflict of laws, there are three main approaches available. So every international commercial contract should include expressed clauses that determine which of the two sets of legal systems should be used. Generally, the choice of legal system is made by the exporter rather than the distributor, the buyer or the agent. However, that doesn't preclude possible resolution of dispute in a court of importer. And then the use of your Incoterms for all transacting parties. It's a worldwide universal term incorporated into your trade contracts between importers and exporters to guide all those involved in international trade, such as the importers, the exporters, the transporters, and the insurers. These rules are divided into rules of any mode of transport and those for sea and inland transport. But it's important that parties such as importers and exporters, as well as aligned agents, all have a thorough knowledge of your Incoterms. International arbitration may be nominated by parties. The arbitration tribunals are increasingly becoming an alternative resolution mechanism for parties in dispute. Now, international transactions involve up to 4 or 5 parties. You've got the agents, the third-party logistic provider, the importer, the exporter, the shipping company, and up to 4 separate contracts. So firstly, you've got the contract for carriage, a legally binding agreement containing the conditions of carriage, setting out the rights and obligations of the carrier and the shipper. So it will include things like what's being carried and how liability for damage or injury could be assessed, apportioned and paid. You've got the sales contract, a formal agreement between the buyer and the seller that identifies the parties of the transaction and sets out the terms and conditions, such as delivery and price. And they're governed by laws and regulations of 2 or more countries, and Incoterms are widely used. The insurance contract, a legally binding agreement where the insurer accepts insurance risks from the policyholder by agreeing to commensurate the policyholder if an uncertain event happens that would adversely affect the policyholder. And Incoterms again here are used in such contracts that set the obligations of those parties. So for example, if you've got CIF, cost, insurance and freight, the seller pays for the insurance. But if you're CFR, cost and freight only, the buyer has to pay the insurance. And then contract for finance, a short-term loan agreement which bridges the gap between taking and ordering the goods and being paid for. The loan is secured against specific contracts of purchase orders and not the entire ledger, and therefore gives flexibility to access working capital locked up in the transactions. Now, the Vienna Convention on Contracts for the International Sale of Goods Act gives a standardised international sales law. It came into effect in 1988. It was developed to enable international trade by establishing a system of rules and regulations for the standardised uniform buying and selling of goods. It's been signed into national law by more than 90 countries, including Korea, Germany, Russia, Nigeria, Australia, China, New Zealand, and the USA. It was designed to take into consideration the diversity of legal approaches and traditions of many countries around the world, and to equitably allocate risk between the seller and the buyer. So the Sale of Goods Act is applicable to all sale contracts between parties from different countries, only if the following have taken place. The transacting parties have selected the law of one of the contracting countries of their contract. The appropriate contract law results in the use of laws of a contracting country. Transacting parties choose the international sale of goods in their contract. Both or all transacting parties are residents of contracting countries when transacting parties have made no clear and explicit choice of law. The parties concur that their contract be governed by national law of a contracting country. If the transacting parties have not specifically or explicitly selected a law to govern their contract, the probability is high that this International Sale of Goods Act will apply. But it applies to contracts for sale undertaken at commodity exchanges such as crude oil, wheat, and soybeans. It doesn't apply to certain types of goods and contracts like consumptions for private or personal effect, auctioned goods, the sale of stocks and shares, bonds and investments, sale of ships or aeroplanes, electricity. But in general, it does not apply to service contracts between transacting parties. So buyers and sellers may opt out of the Vienna Convention completely or partially by inserting a choice of law provision in the international sale contract. Now, when cargoes move from one country to another, they may pass through several international borders and different legal regimes governing the contract. International conventions have been developed to reduce uncertainty that may arise from conflicting legal systems. Trade blocs and free trade areas like the Australian and Indonesia and single markets like the European Union have lent themselves to free movement of goods and people, which means there are no custom examination processes and no cross-border controls. Legal consideration in global markets include the shipment documentation, which varies significantly depending on the mode of transport used, the nature of the cargo being shipped, and specific practices in a particular line of international trade. So, for example, if you're shipping by sea, you require as a minimum a bill of lading, a commercial invoice, a packing list, certificate of origin, certificate of marine insurance, and where required, a pro forma invoice and pre-shipment inspection certificate. There may be additional requirements for the transport of livestock and dangerous goods and cargo. Insurance cover is required in Incoterms. The seller and buyer can negotiate who will pay for the insurance cover. The seller is not obligated to pay for insurance on behalf of the buyer. And then handling. Good packaging can be used to reduce damage that can be caused by goods in transit, as well as reduced insurance costs and optimised space. There are packing specification regulations for various modes of transport, such as dangerous cargoes in air transport. The customs clearance is the process for clearing things through the customs and excise, and that differs from one country to another. In general, an importer first fills out a custom entry form, which notifies the customs authorities of the country that the organisation will import it to. But other documents may be required to accompany the customs entry, like an invoice, a certificate of origin, certificate of insurance, and in some cases, pre-shipment inspection certificates and quarantine certificates. And then finally, payment. When making payment for the international transactions, the focus of the parties is often on reducing financial risk and currency exposure. The three main factors that you want to consider are credit terms, the choice of currency, and the method of payment. And that's the end of Learning Outcome 2. Thank you for watching.